Today we're going to talk a little bit about theories and models of language acquisition. In thinking about theories of language acquisition, as future speech-language pathologists, speech-language pathology assistants, and teachers, it's important for us to look at them because theories tell us what causes children to acquire language. How does it happen? And why is this so important for us to know? As future educators, we're going to be working with children who are having difficulty acquiring language. And the theories let us know what factors are most important in propelling this process forward. So your theoretical orientation is going to drive what you do in intervention. And that's why they are so important for us to know about. We're going to start in this video clip looking at four classic models of language learning. And there are four discussed in your text, but we're just going to talk about three of them. And those are the nativist orientation of linguistic theory, which is a structuralist theory, whose main proponent is Noam Chomsky. The empiricist models, we're going to talk about two of them. We're going to talk about behaviorism, which was initially developed by B.F. Skinner as a comprehensive theory of learning, and social interactionism or sociolinguistic theory. All of these are discussed in your text, but I want to talk a little bit about some of the highlights of each. The nativist orientation presumes that children are born with everything they need to learn language. So they're looking at innate factors. What do people have? What makes human beings able to acquire this complex system? Whereas an empiricist orientation is looking at the input one receives from its environment. Their idea is that the child is born with very little knowledge of language and learns everything through interaction with the environment. So we're going to start at the nativist end with linguistic theory. And this is the theory that believes children are born with everything they need to know to learn language. They believe that children are pre-wired for language, and they need minimal environmental exposure. Chomsky and his colleagues proposed a concept called the language acquisition device, which is something that is in people's brains when they're born, and it contains all of the rules that one will need to know to eventually understand human language. The focus of this theory is on syntax and the neurological mechanism which allows us to deduce syntactic rules. On the other end of the continuum, on the empiricist end, we have behaviorism. And behaviorism, in stark contrast to Chomsky's theory, believes that the environment is critical. Environmental input is what drives language acquisition. So according to behaviorism, if you have more exposure to words, more exposure to sentences, more exposure to language in general, you'll learn more language. This theory believes that parents teach their children language through stimulus, response, reinforcement methods. So the parents will provide a word for the child, say dog. The child says dog. They say good job, and maybe even let them pet that dog. So the idea behind behaviorism is caregivers are critical because they're the teachers of language. They're providing the stimulus that the child gets to respond to, and they're also reinforcing correct productions. Another important concept about behaviorism is that language is learned in parts. You can break it apart into individual components, sounds and words, and then link those words together into phrases and eventually chain them into sentences. So the idea behind behaviorism is that children learn language because they hear it a lot and they're rewarded for using it. A third theory that we're going to look at from the empiricist point of view is social interactionism, or as your book calls it, sociolinguistic theory. This theory is described in your text as a newer theory, but it's still one of the classic theories describing language acquisition. The idea here, like with behaviorism, is that input is important. It's critical. The environment drives language acquisition. But it's different than behaviorism in that the child is perceived as active. The child is actually born with a motivation to communicate. They're interested in communicating, and they express their intents. But what's really important about driving the language acquisition process from this orientation is the caregivers. What the caregivers do to help that child communicate his message, to expand, to extend, to scaffold his efforts to communicate so he can do so more effectively. Vygotsky's ideas that we studied earlier in the semester about the zone of proximal development fit very well in this theory, in this model, because the caregivers are so important to the language acquisition process because they're scaffolding and supporting the child to use language in authentic contexts. So the idea here is that children develop language because their caregivers notice what they want to communicate about and they support their efforts. This theory is sometimes confused with behaviorism because they are both input-based theories, but the difference is that in behaviorism, the caregivers are important because they're teaching language. They're providing stimuli and reinforcing the child's efforts. In behaviorism, the child's passive. He's only responding to the input that the caregivers give him. Whereas in social interactionism, the child is active. The child is born with that desire to communicate and he's trying. But the caregivers are so important because they are noticing what he wants to communicate about and helping him or supporting his efforts.